Well, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to Apostate of Mind. I'm Mark Peralta, and I am super thrilled to be here on this December 23rd of the year 2023. This is my going to begin my third year of having deconverted from Christianity and religion altogether. So this is exciting, and we have a new look. So I hope that you guys are enjoying the new logo, A Positive Mind Podcast. And so I'm happy to feature that behind this. And for this evening, I've got something that's not pre-planned, but I saw the video and I'm like, I need to react to it because this is important, especially uh, right now. It's relevant to us because everyone around us is celebrating Christmas, and the topic of the birth of Jesus comes up. There's always the occasional evangelizing that takes on in families. And so if you're like me, who's going to be joining the rest of family who continues to perhaps be religious fanatics still, you might strike up a conversation or two, or they might say something to try to convince you of how prophecy fulfills in Jesus. And that, to me, the most important prophecy that is heralded by the apologists, by the missionaries, is Isaiah 7:14, the famous passage where the prophet Isaiah seems to announce the future birth of a special child um, that will be born from a virgin, apparently. And so, does Matthew say, and Luke seems to follow suit. Because keep in mind, Mark doesn't say anything. Mark is completely silent regarding the birth of Jesus. But I don't know. That seems, we can leave that detail off to the side. The point remains is Christianity claims that uh, the prophet Isaiah prophesied this birth, and that the proof is there. But what they are really highlighting from that passage, because there's a lot of nuances to it, and we might get to them today. But the one nuance about the Isaiah 7:14 passage that they want to highlight is this thing about Jesus being born of a virgin, which, if you read the original Isaiah, if you read the context from where that comes from, that doesn't seem to really fit the concept of a virgin conception as the sign that the prophet Isaiah is talking about in verse 14. So what I've got for you to keep things lively, because I can get pretty boring. Yeah, and quite frankly, I'm not that smart. I'm gonna show you a video that is a chapel service over at the Master Seminary, and I'll tell you a little bit about the Master Seminary, where Mr. or Doctor, I should say, Doctor, what is his name? Todd Bolen. Dr. Todd Bolen, who is a Bible scholar. He is both a graduate from the Master Seminary and Dallas Theological Seminary, where I studied and graduated from. And so we kind of share a background. Now, the Master Seminary is basically John McArthur's the famous preacher. That's his seminary. I believe he is no longer president, but he used to be for quite a while. This seminary is also known for preaching or coming up with the whole concept of lordship salvation. Those of you that perhaps don't know much about that, it's one of those kind of controversial views on salvation, in that it seems to be where within Protestant Christianity, the perspective that Jesus, his death on the cross was sufficient payment for anyone's salvation. It seems like it doesn't really require works, although the Catholic Church will disagree. And so lordship salvation sort of comes out of evangelical Protestantism, then sort of saying, hey, no, but you're supposed to make Jesus Lord of your life. And so with that comes, you've got to obey and do good works. And if that's not present in your life, then perhaps you're not saved. I hope I'm doing it justice. I should have maybe prepared on giving you a summary of that perspective. But I just wanted to mention the Master Seminary is known for this. And I don't think that has anything to do with tonight's subject. But I don't know, maybe some of that bias will come out. So I guess without further ado, I am seeing some of you have joined. What's up, James? I see Ray APL. Welcome to the channel. And so today we are going to be reacting live to a video from a very strong Bible scholar from within evangelical Protestantism that is going to argue in favor of the traditional perspective that Isaiah 7:14 is a prophecy that's fulfilled in Jesus, aka the virgin conception, and that whole thing. So let me go ahead and expand the view here. And without further ado, folks, I present you Mr. Todd Bolen. See, for copyright
Well, it's good to be with you this morning.
I'll have to speed it up.
I have been asked to speak about Isaiah 7:14, what has been called
you might like that
the most controversial passage in the Bible. And central to this debate is the meaning of the word alma, whether this Hebrew word should be translated as virgin or young woman.
I hope you guys can hear.
Word alone has been,
if not, let me know in the chat.
One of the most heated debates in Hebrew semantics. So a bit of a challenge before us this morning, but I would rather speak with you about the glories of Isaiah and the revelation of the coming Messiah. In fact, I'm going to do that, but I'm also going to not neglect my charge to speak to Isaiah 7:14. That is the prophecy, I'm turning there now to Isaiah 7:14, of the virgin birth, which, as I hope to show you, is a gloriously beautiful link in a revelatory chain about the incarnation of the Son of God. There's a problem, and that is many scholars say that this verse is not speaking directly about Jesus, but is speaking about a near-term fulfillment. That is, a young woman gave birth to a baby in the 8th century, in the time of Isaiah. Look at it with me. 7:14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. In verse 16, for before the boy will know to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. So many say that this passage, this prophecy, had to have been fulfilled in the 8th century, that the baby was born then. Many evangelicals say this. They hold to an 8th century fulfillment. I'll give you some examples from godly men. I don't agree with them, but let me quote to you first Dr. Eugene Merl. He says this: the lexicography and grammar certainly favor the idea that a young woman, well known to King Ahaz and the prophet, would soon give birth to a child. Rodney Decker writes, Isaiah did not prophesy regarding the birth of Messiah. He would not have known that his prophecy of the destruction of Aram and of Israel, of the birth of a son as a sign of God's presence with his people, and of the explanatory text surrounding those statements had any reference beyond the 8th century BC. And Steve Moyse, if this is a prediction of the birth of Jesus 700 years hence, then it makes utter nonsense of the story being narrated in Isaiah.
By the way, folks, the scholars he just quoted were my professors in seminary. Eugene Merl, He's an expert in Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And then I think he said Derlbach. He's also a very famous Dallas Theological Seminary professor. And so in Dallas Theological Seminary is a very conservative theological seminary. So even these guys in there are admitting that perhaps the context of Isaiah 7:14 is much is more than you think, is more than what Matthew seems to be able to glean what he's gleaning from it, because there's a historical context. And by the way, before we get into the historical context, we also need to ask ourselves, is Isaiah 7:14 really a prophecy? You know, it's almost like among Christians, it's a given, you know, because Matthew quotes it, and he certainly seems to make the case that it is prophetic. But is it really prophetic? Like, if you go back to Isaiah, and I challenge you, if you care about this enough to go back and read it, you will notice that there's nothing prophetic about that passage, in the sense that it's making a prediction of something in the future, like Nostradamus is saying something. Most certainly not. It's only prophetic in the sense that it's revealing the working of Yahweh in that historical event. That's it. Prophecy is often misdefined. You know, it's almost like most people, or at least where I come from, we think of prophecy as like these predictions, like these sort of like encoded messages in the Old Testament that not perhaps, but are actually pointing to some future event that will then bring about something into a fulfillment of it. And certainly there might be some things in the Old Testament that are indeed prophetic in that sense. Like some of the other passages in the prophets where they talk about, you know, the coming of the kingdom, like the messianic age, and like a time where, you know, everyone's heart will turn to God, and the law would be written in their hearts, and then all the nations would look upon Jerusalem as the center of humanity and whatnot, the political center. Perhaps that's prophetic, but this 7:14 isn't. What that is a conversation between the prophet Isaiah and King Ahaz, who is king from Jerusalem. So he's in Jerusalem. When is this happening? Well, this is happening during a historical context that the prophet Isaiah, or the author, which, by the way, there are many scholars today that think that Isaiah was not like, it didn't come from like one source. You hear things like Deutero Isaiah, or there's like perhaps different sections, and I don't know them. I haven't like looked deep enough into that, but I know that there are sections that are sort of like kind of pasted together, like some of the messages and the traditions were gathered from throughout different times in history, you know. So it's not like someone just sat down and, like, you know, wrote things down beginning to end, but rather a collection of traditions that, you know, with the passing of time, they become syncretized or amalgamated together. And now when we look at Isaiah, it looks like it's a one book, because we assume that's how it is. We assume that because it has the one title, and you know, our Bibles are, you know, giving us, you know, clues. But in reality, these traditions were just amalgamated together. And so clearly there are different types of literature as well present in Isaiah that one has to account when interpreting whatever. So in this case, there is what's known as the Syrio-Ephraimite War. the Syrio, as in Syria, Ephraimite war, which was basically, um, to summarize this entire history, you have nations that are sort of taking advantage from the fact that the Assyrians had conquered Israel. So, you know how the nation was kind of divided into two, or the monarchy was divided into two? You had Israel at the north and Judah in the south. Jerusalem is located in Judah in the south. So the north, Israel, has been taken captive by the Assyrians. And because of that, Judah is a little weak. And so you have surrounding nations, in this case, Syria and Ephraim, which are neighbors. They sort of kind of conspire with Assyria to allow them to invade Judah and let them put a new king. There's a lot of details to it, so just go back and read from the beginning of Isaiah 7, and you'll see that. My point is, there's a historical narrative here that must be taken into account when interpreting Isaiah 7:14. So the Assyrians are threatened, they're big threats, and so naturally King Ahaz in Jerusalem is a little scared, and Isaiah the prophet approaches him, and King Ahaz is not a good guy. Like, it seems like he got in trouble often, as was the case with many kings. In fact, there's an interesting pattern in that you have like a good king followed by a bad king, and followed by a good king, and et cetera, et cetera. So Ahaz is kind of like the bad king, and he's not having it. He doesn't care about what Isaiah has to say. He doesn't care about that. Isaiah is basically pleading with him, like, "Hey, I need you to ask for a sign that this is going to be okay, because they're about to take over. We're about to lose everything. So do something, King." And King Ahaz is like, "No, I don't want to mess with it. I don't want to ask for a sign." And then Isaiah's response to that is, "You know what? Yahweh is still gonna give you a sign, so I'm gonna give it to you anyway. Whether you want to hear it or not, here's a sign." And apparently, it's not good news, but you have to kind of keep reading to get that. The sign is that this person, whether it's young woman or virgin, and we're gonna get to that, but will born a child, right? Will give birth to a child. And most Christians want to stop right there, because they're like, "Oh, see, it reads, the virgin shall conceive a child, and she will call his name Emmanuel." Well, if you keep reading, as it turns out, the sign that Isaiah is saying that Yahweh is going to give King Ahaz is not the conception of a child by some virgin, which would be miraculous in a sense. But this isn't about a miracle. This is about a sign. So now you got to ask yourself, what could possibly be the prophet Isaiah have in mind when he says, "The Lord will give you a sign"? What's he talking about? Is he saying like a post-it sign, or some sort of like picture sign? What is it? What's a sign? Well, whatever it is, it has to be something visible, right? I think that's what's in view here. That Yahweh will present something that will cause Ahaz to see and be like, "Wow, maybe I really should care about what Yahweh has to say." In this case, it's meant to be a word of hope. You know, it's he's trying to give him courage to keep on keeping on because Yahweh has plans to save them, right? And if you want to know more about that story, because that narrative still continues, you have to go to Second Chronicles. But there you'll read how eventually, and it was not King Ahaz, it was eventually King Ahaz's son, which became the very next king. That during his time, the invaders, who then at that point surround Jerusalem, are killed by Yahweh and are thus saved for a period of time, which is what Isaiah had in view with regards to this sign that he's proposing King Ahaz to ask for. So going back to my point of it being visible, because certainly a virgin conception is not something that can be visible, or is it? Like, how would King Ahaz be witness of a virgin conceiving a boy and becoming pregnant? Like, the prophet Isaiah have in mind that King Ahaz would maybe, I don't know, double inspect the organs and make sure that she's a virgin. Okay, that's possible. But then what? He's gonna look at her all day, every day, and then notice that she starts getting pregnant? Like, is that what was in view? I don't think so. And the reason why I say I don't think so is because if you keep reading verse 15 and on, you'll see how the prophet says that it's it's about the child coming to age. And it gives sort of like two scenarios. One is he mentions that by the time he will basically wean off milk, is what's in view here. That by that time, that this salvation will come about. So by the time, because really the prophet Isaiah is like, if I were to sort of paint the picture here, he is standing before King Ahaz, and he is perhaps pointing at some young girl. We'll get to that. And he's saying, hey, the sign will be that this young girl, so she must be present there, will conceive and bear a child. And in fact, I would argue that if you look at the Hebrew grammars, and if you make reference to that verb, the conceiving verb is actually in past tense. It's not in future tense. So a better reading or a better translation is the young woman is with child, like she is already pregnant. So that should already preclude any kind of future prediction event, from taking place, because the prophet's already telling you she's already pregnant. But it's not about the pregnancy. It's about like when the child comes of age. By the time this child that's soon to be born can tell the difference between right and wrong, this will happen. And so that's what he's talking about. So that the king would be able to see, because the king would be, all right, somebody check on the kid, right? Has he already weaned off milk? Tell me, now how long would the time period be? I mean, it'd be anywhere between that, however long it took her to give birth. She was pregnant, within 9-10 months, and then maybe 2-3 years perhaps. So that's really the context. Is King Ahaz, you're going to notice this kid is going to be born, and you'll see by this time God will save you. And so therefore take courage, stay hopeful that something good is coming. And that's what's really intended here. not the witnessing of some miraculous conception that, again, how could Ahaz really see the moment of a virgin conceiving a woman? I mean, something conceiving here. So what's happening really in the Christian context is they describe something sort of like a bird or some sort of spirit hovering over Mary, and then I don't know, illegitimately having some divine intercourse here. Like, what's really in mind here? I know what's in mind. I think what they're thinking like the rest of their fellow Greco-Roman worshippers, those that knew the stories of the demigods like Apollo, of people that were uh, of other miraculous births, like that between a god and a human. That's what's in view here. So for them, that's it fits that Greco-Roman narrative. But the Gospel of Matthew, who's you know using that verse from Isaiah, is pulling that and then using it inappropriately. That's what I have to say. So, all right. So we do have a video, and see how it is. I can go on forever. But let's get back to Dr. Bolen.
Now, Jewish scholars and liberals are quite content to leave it right there. A child was born in the time of Isaiah, the prophecy was fulfilled, and that's that. But evangelicals can't say that, because Matthew claims that Isaiah 7:14 was fulfilled in the birth of Jesus to the Virgin Mary. I'm turning there. You don't have to. You can stay in Isaiah if you like, but I'm going to just read from Matthew 1:22. Now, all this took place in order that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet.
So you see what he just did. He just created a false dichotomy by saying that, if you're a Christian, you can't see it that way, because then, look, the Gospel of Matthew certainly is looking at it that way. So isn't he's just sort of saying, like, only true Christians, like, unlike the scholars that I just quoted you, that are experts on this and are in stark disagreement with you, they're are they not Christians? I don't know. Sounds weird.
Prophet would be fulfilled, saying, behold, the virgin shall be with child and shall bear a son, and they shall call his name Immanuel, which translated means God with us. So what do? If you're an evangelical, you believe in the inspiration of Matthew, and yet it seems to you that Isaiah is talking about something in his own day.
Oh, by the way, something that I learned from Rabbi Moshe Shulman, from a prior episode, was that evangelicals make much of, like, the literal meaning of some of these names, and they seem to be always kind of cherry picking, because some names they don't make a great deal out of it, like Gabriel, or other names that include either an L ending or some sort of Jah ending, or names of other folks in the scripture, like Daniel, for example. That means something related to God and has the word God in it. And no one's making the case that Daniel, for example, was a divine being, because his name is Daniel, which I don't know if you know what it means. Put it in the chat. I forgot what the Dan in the Daniel. Yeah, I don't know. But it includes the ending L. So that doesn't make him a divine being. So why should then we be thinking that what Isaiah has in mind for this child that's to be called Emmanuel is that he's a divine being all of a sudden, just because his name includes the word God in it? In fact, there is a tradition, and this is like why it's mentioned in the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is not trying to lead people towards idolatry. They're not trying to give you like, oh, here's this guy who's perhaps a divine being. No, what they're trying to do with the whole name meaning reference is simply to communicate something about the understanding. Is a reflection. It's sort of like something that is just symbolic of the context of what's happening. And what is that context that's happening that we just went over? And how might that relate to the naming of that child as Immanuel? Well, if you understand the context of what's happening, you would realize that what's happening here, this war between foreign nations and Judah, who is considered by, this tradition as the nation that was assigned to Yahweh, and that Yahweh is he gave that land to them, and Yahweh is their God. That whole concept is directly tied to this, because what the naming of that child of as Emmanuel is really doing is telling King Ahaz through the meaning of his name that Yahweh is on his side. Okay, so it has figurative theological implications. It's not meant to be prescribing ontological implications. Okay, things related to being, like, oh, this kid, because his name is God is with us, then ontologically speaking, that means he's going to be a God. Absolutely not. That's what Christianity is doing. Are they correct in doing so? I don't know. Is it a Mishnah? Perhaps. How much freedom do they have for doing that? I don't know. I think they're overstretching this text, and that's my problem with it. So going back to the naming of this kid, which, by the way, he's going to make mention of another child that's part of that ongoing story. I believe Isaiah chapter 8. There's another child, Mahar Halar Hashbas, or something like that. I'm kind of going off memory here. That has a meaning. And then the meaning of his name is also indicative of this situation. In this case, it will be something that's kind of like not good news. And so it's simply speaking to the surrounding narrative, what's happening there. So how come we're not making much deal about the meaning of that child on that verse? Why are we so spotlighting 7:14, which has the name Emmanuel? And then you have the name of another child later on that he'll mention it in his video. That's often quoted. It's the one that, the verse escapes me, but it's the one that says something like, and he will be the wonderful counselor, the mighty God, and it has a few other things there that most apologists will look at that and be like, yeah, see, these are titles for the Messiah. And it's like, no, these are not titles. They're not ontological prescriptions for this character. They're simply speaking of the theological oomph that's happening in the story. That's it. But I digress too much. Let's go back to our video. And by the way, if you're still sticking around with me, thank you. I'm glad to see you guys. You guys are here, and I'm keeping an eye on the comment section and see if I see any questions. And let's go back to our video.
And the answer is creative hermeneutics. This is the way out. This is the solution that's proposed. They said that there was not one woman and one Emmanuel, but two women and two Emmanuel childs. They appeal to sensus plenior and double fulfillment and typology. Let me give an example of some of what they say in their own words. I don't consider these explanations to be convincing, but let me give you a taste from what they've written. Dr. Eugene Merl, this is a classic example of a messianic text which, while having a limited meaning in its historical context, goes beyond that meaning in a future Christological context. Dr. Robert Chisholm writes, Matthew applied Isaiah's ancient prophecy of Immanuel's birth to Jesus. The first Immanuel was a reminder to the people of God's presence and a guarantee of a greater child to come who would manifest God's presence in an even greater way.
Nice. So that's where they take it a step further. They're sneaking in the conversation, this thing, I don't know if you caught it, the whole double fulfillment thing. Like, where did you guys get that from? Like, how is that possible? Like, where do you get this thing that for some reason Isaiah didn't just have in mind his current situation with regards to King Ahaz and what God's trying to communicate through that story, from the perspective of the authors, because I don't believe in God, but and what's happening there, that's not what that was really about. That this was really about something that would occur how long? 700 years later. So from the time of the living and kicking Isaiah to the birth of Jesus, that's a 700-year gap. One of those principles that they teach you in seminary is that you should read meaning into any text, especially take meaning that isn't from the Hebrew Bible and adding it on top of it, like you're reading through a filter. What you have to do is you got to kind of go back and think for yourself, okay, what could have the original authors have intended for the original audience, however long ago, 2,500 years ago or whatnot. And then they let that drive with whatever the text is saying, let that drive the meaning. That's called exegesis. But no, what New Testament authors are doing, and the Christian church is sort of going along with it, because why not? They're seeing Jesus in it, and they're saying, oh, this is really meant to be about this dude 700 years later on a completely different context, because the birth of Jesus isn't about some imminent attack by some foreign nation, for example. Because if there were some continuity between and I'm going to do quote unquote historicity to this narrative in Isaiah 7, because it could have been totally invented. If there's going to be any continuity between that text and that narrative and, I don't know, something in the future happening that perhaps there's some double fulfillment, you could say, at the very least, I'd expect that there's continuity within the plot itself, right? Like maybe a future king, not Ahaz, but another future king that will be facing a very similar scenario, namely an imminent attack from foreign invaders, and where their God, Yahweh, is communicating a word of hope. Okay, if that were the case, I could go along with that, but I'm not seeing that happening with regards to the birth of Jesus. With regards to the birth of Jesus, we don't have some imminent attack. It's not a word of hope to any king, and if anything, is bad news. Within the text of Matthew, King Herod considered the birth of Jesus as very bad news. So it's almost like the complete opposite. And it's not really a sign either. It's just kind of like pointing towards a miraculous birth, which does not fit miraculous birth context of, I would say, Hebrew traditions. What do I mean by that? If you consider examples from the Hebrew Bible, from the Old Testament, that talk about the births of special characters, namely Isaac and others, you're going to see that whenever there are these miraculous births, it's not about the conception. It's always about the age of the mother and the father. Like in the case of Isaac, it has to do with how Abraham and Sarah were very old, and it had to do with the fact that she was barren. Okay, so if we can categorize Jewish miraculous births, how are those like? You've got very old parents, and they're usually barren. Oh, she gets pregnant, miracle, hallelujah, right? But this business about a virgin conception is, in my opinion, completely foreign to Hebrew prophetic literature and Hebrew or Jewish traditions. But rather, virgin conceptions are the very thing of the Greco-Roman literature traditions. So, how do we know this? Well, just look up the background stories to the births of many of these semigods in those Greco-Roman pantheons, like Apollo and others that are like the mixture between divine beings and human beings. Okay. And so that's what I think is happening. I think perhaps Matthew, when it came to his own rendering of the gospel, or the people that were behind this gospel of Matthew, they're looking at Mark and they're saying, you didn't really talk about them. And, there's like these other guys that have miraculous births. So maybe we should include that as part of our argument. And so certainly these people would have been familiar with stories about semigods and their births and so forth. So I think there's a possibility that there was some emulation, or as is often mentioned today within academic circles, is the literary practice of mimesis, Memesis, which is in the Latin imitatio and is a form of sophisticated way of writing biographies in antiquity, by not necessarily copying, but emulating certain archetypes of special characters, namely divine beings, especially sons of gods, and how they came to be. And they're sort of like telling the same story without telling the same story. So let's go back to our video. There's a lot more to cover, and I don't want to speak all night. So here we go.
Second Immanuel is God with us in a heightened and infinitely superior sense. He fulfills Isaiah's Immanuel prophecy by bringing the typology intended by God to realization and by filling out or completing the pattern designed by God. And one more, Dr. Darrell Bach. So Isaiah points to a woman who is currently a virgin, who will give birth to a child. That child's arrival is the sign, represents God with us, and starts the clock ticking on Ahaz's judgment. The child contextually would probably be Maher-shalal.
Oh, I apologize. I may have kicked the screen by mistake. Let's go back to it.
Child that has a second escalated realization in Jesus. Both women were virgins at the time of the prediction, but in the escalation, the second has a virgin birth. None of these explanations make any sense to me. I don't know how a text can go beyond its own meaning. I don't know how Isaiah 7:14 is both fulfilled and a guarantee of a greater child to come, and I don't know how Isaiah 7:14 is a potential pattern text pointing to a second child. If a mother conceived and Emmanuel was born, the prophecy is fulfilled. Period. You cannot arbitrarily invent a second woman and a second Emmanuel child any more than you can invent a third woman and a third Emmanuel child. You cannot use the New Testament as the basis for finding some extra meaning in the text. In fact, the point of Matthew and of all the New Testament apostles was that the Old Testament was the basis for what was found in the New Testament. And if what they preached didn't fit the Old Testament, they were wrong. But that's exactly what modern evangelicals are claiming, that the New Testament creates new meaning in the Old Testament.
Yeah, it is. And some of these guys are perfectly okay with that. But I think there's a possibility that there were some emulations. And so, The problem is there are some who are going to see that as like, okay, so are they being deceitful here? Are they just changing? Because it doesn't sound like actual prophecy is taking place. It sounds like they're taking what sounds like prophecy and they're making it fit their theology. I think that's exactly what's going on. We do need to talk about whether or not the actual word in the text should be translated young woman or virgin, because that's really like where that's at the heart of this debate, is like, what does that word actually mean? And he's going to tell you what it means, but he's going to lie to you, actually. And so I'm prepared to show you some slides so we can I can show you why I'm going to say that he's a liar on this, or that he's, well, I can't see that he's lying, but maybe he is misinformed. Although someone at this level, like PhD level, should know better. Maybe he's just misinformed. I don't know. But I'm going to let him kind of mention that, and then I'll correct him. We'll see.
You know where this goes? Let me quote to you from an article called Matthew Twists the Scriptures. S.V. McCaslin, he's not an evangelical, of course. He writes this, but this is logically where this leads. Matthew's use of Isaiah 7:14 shows how a misinterpreted passage might be just as influential as one correctly understood. Since we have discovered that Matthew felt free in changing and distorting the Scriptures, it becomes a probability that he has used an even freer hand in modifying, rearranging, and shaping documents not protected by scriptural sanctity, sources of a popular character which he used in putting together his gospel. And that is just what we find in examining Matthew's gospel in comparison with Mark and Luke. In other words, if we allow Matthew the hermeneutical liberty of finding a second virgin in Isaiah 7:14, we can't deny him that same liberty in changing his sources about the life, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus. What I want to show you this morning is why we should understand from the text of Isaiah that there was not and could not possibly have been a child born in the 8th century that fulfilled or even partially fulfilled this prophecy. I'm going to do that in two ways. First, I'm going to show you how the greater context excludes the possibility of a short-term fulfillment. The greater context. I'm going to make my argument.
So, if I may just kind of put it in simple words here, he's creating another dichotomy by saying that it's either this way or is this way. Okay? Which may not necessarily be the case, because sometimes it could be other ways, and you don't get to say it's either this or this and make people choose. What's he saying? He's saying that there are some who say that Isaiah 7:14 could only have been something that would be fulfilled within their lifetime, within the time of Isaiah, within the time of King Ahaz. And there are some that are affirming that it could not have happened or be fulfilled during the time of Isaiah. That's what he's going to say. And I'm not so sure that you can just get away by saying that, because if you read the story, okay, it would make no sense, absolute no sense, for Isaiah to pretend to provide a word of encouragement, a word of hope to King Ahaz, and make reference to some historical soon-to-be event that would have possibly not been something that King Ahaz would witness. Like, why would Isaiah offer a sign from Yahweh to King Ahaz, a sign that could only take place 700 years later? That just makes no sense. But I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what he says.
Without even looking at chapter 7. And number two, I'm going to show you how the immediate context, and then second half we're going to focus on chapter 7, show you how the immediate context demands a single fulfillment that can only occur after judgment comes on Judah. So I'm going to start with the greater context. That means I'm going to go back to chapter 1, and we're going to move fast. Chapters 1 through 12 are recognized as a unit, sometimes referred to as the Book of Immanuel. Everybody agrees on that? This is the broader context of chapter 7. And how does it begin? With judgment. Verse 2. Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for Yahweh speaks. Sons I have reared and raised up, but they have transgressed against me. An ox knows its owner, and a donkey its master's manger. But Israel does not know. My people do not perceive. Verse 8, the daughter of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a watchman's hut in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. Unless Yahweh of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom, we would be like Gomorrah. Israel is guilty, and they're going to be judged. Verse 21, how the faithful city has become a harlot, she who was full of justice. Righteousness once lodged in her, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your drink diluted with water. Your rulers are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and pursues rewards. They do not execute justice for the orphan, nor does the widow's plea come before them. I can look at any of these verses. I just pulled out a few to make the point. Israel's guilty, and judgment's coming. But that's not all. You scan your eye down a few more verses. There's a chapter break here, but same context. Verse 2, Isaiah 2:2. Now it will be in the last days. The mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as the head of the mountains, and will be lifted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it, and many peoples will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us from his ways, and we may walk in his paths. For from Zion the law will go forth, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations. So we have, you're guilty, judgment's coming. But on the other side of that judgment, in the last days, the people will come to the Lord. There is hope, there is deliverance, there is salvation. The rest of chapter 2 and chapter 3 talks more about their guilt and their judgment. We go to chapter 4. They're guilty, judgment's coming, but chapter 4, verse 2, in that day, the branch of Yahweh will be beautiful and glorious. Verse 3, it will be that he who remains in Zion and is left in Jerusalem will be called holy. There's going to be a transformation. Yes, judgment's coming, but there's glory on the other side of it. The branch of the Lord and the holiness of the people. And verse 5, Yahweh will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her convocation a cloud by day, even smoke, and the brightness of a flaming fire by night. That sure sounds a lot like the glory of God over his people, over Jerusalem. So judgment's coming, but God will be with his people. Chapter 5, the famous song of the vineyard. What's the point?
By the way, every time he mentions the word Lord in there, I want you to think of Yahweh, because he's actually naming the God by name. It's a lot easier if you're a Christian to read those passages and completely miss the fact that the God who is to be the author of what he's reading is actually a named God, and it's not Jesus. It's not Yeshua. It's actually Yahweh. And so, how do we just all of a sudden think, oh, well, that means Jesus too? No, that's not what the text is saying.
Judgment is coming upon a fruitless nation. In chapter 6, after Isaiah's encounter with a holy, holy, holy God, his sin is atoned for, and the Lord gives him a mission. Verse 10, what is his mission? Render the hearts of this people insensitive, their ears dull, and their eyes dim, lest they see with their eyes and hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and return to be healed. And I said, Lord, how long? And he said, exile. That's the one-word summary of that verse. Until the cities are devastated without inhabitant, houses are without people. So Isaiah's commission is to preach judgment to preach their judgment until the judgment comes. That's the near-term situation. It's not hope. It's very clear. There's nothing in these chapters of Isaiah that speak about a short-term hope. The short-term reality is God's judgment. That is what Isaiah is preaching. The land will be devastated. The people will be carried off, verse 12, verse 13. Yet there will be a tenth portion in it. And again, it will be subject to burning. So this destruction is going to be pretty thorough. But that's not the end. Like a terebinth or like an oak whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. There's a stump that remains. I mean, like the forest is cut down, but there's a stump that remains. There is hope on the other side of judgment. There's a remnant after the exile. The holy seed. Don't forget.
Yeah, there's a remnant after the exile. Why is that important? Because you seem to just kind of skip over that. That's really important simply because if there's an actual Isaiah that existed, this would have been in the 8th century BC. And perhaps he is writing during the time of the exile. And so what he's thinking, what he has in mind, if he existed, he's thinking, Israel has been taken captive. And there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is, well, God had to bring about judgment because the nation is full of sin and all these bad things are happening. And he talks about that in chapters 1 and on. Especially 1 through 3, he talks about that. What's the problem? What's the complaint of the prophet? And it's essentially idolatry, is that the people of Israel are sharing the worship of Yahweh in the temple with other gods. That's an abomination. And so he's thinking the Assyrians took the Israelites captive because of their sin. So those first few chapters of the book of Isaiah are sort of like Isaiah thinking back and considering that, there's going to come a time where we're going to come back after judgment. And this isn't about like judgment day, like the Christians want to talk about, like the end of day. No, the coming back after the judgment from Isaiah's perspective is coming back from the exile itself. Okay. That which only occurs later. And if you keep reading and all the way to the end of Isaiah, you learn about King Cyrus the Great from the Persian Empire, who then plays this pivotal role of helping and sort of like politically making it possible for the Jews to reestablish Jerusalem and start the new temple, or the second temple. So that's the history. It is not, has absolutely nothing to do with the Romans, has absolutely nothing to do with death and an afterlife, which is what Christianity wants to make it about. So try to stick with that, Todd Bolen. Like, it's about the exile. That's it. Don't make it about something else.
Get that. In the chapter that talks about holiness, we have a holy seed. We're going to skip chapter 7, because then we're going to come back and talk about that a lot. So let's just go right over to chapter 8. And what we see here is the same thing. We see immediate judgment is coming. Okay, so there's this child that's born to Isaiah, and he has a name, quick to the spoil, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, because what? Assyria is coming. Don't think, now this is, people can miss this. Some people read carelessly sometimes, and this is not hope. Maher-shalal-Hashbaz is judgment. You say, oh, no. The bad guys, look at verse 4. The wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away. Those are the two enemies who are pressing Ahaz. In chapter 7, we're going to come back and talk about that. But right now, just say, oh, no, we're saved. We're saved. No, the king of Assyria comes, and he doesn't stop coming. Let's keep reading. What does it say? These people, they're rejoicing over their false salvation, verse 6. And so verse 7, the Lord's going to bring upon them the river. What is this river? This river is a metaphor for the king of Assyria. And it's going to, verse 7, it will rise up over all its channels and go over all its banks. It will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass through judgment. There's going to be a big point in chapter 7, but Ahaz seeks salvation from Assyria. God says, okay, Assyria will be your savior. They're going to come and save you, defeat your immediate enemies, and destroy you. That's the river that overfloods its banks. Is there any hope? There is. Look at the end of verse 8, very last phrase. The spread of its wings will fill the breadth of your land, O Emmanuel. Whose land is it? It's that this Emmanuel, as we're going to come back to chapter 7, it's his land. So there's something beyond. This isn't the end of the story. Now let me just pick up one thing. I'm going to say more about this in the journal article. So kind of release me of some things I can say. I'll check it there. But let me just briefly address this. You see this all the time. People say, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz is the...
I really wish that he would be like actual citing verses so that I can go back and check them, because he just gave a whole string of things and didn't really cite anything.
Emmanuel child. He's the fulfillment of the woman, young woman virgin who gives birth. Prophesied in chapter 7. It's fulfilled in chapter 8. Well, I don't think so. Maher-shalal-Hashbaz cannot be, here's the very fast version, the Emmanuel child, because he has the wrong name, wrong mother, wrong father, wrong age, wrong identity, and he's born at the wrong time. Other than that, I think it's a perfect match, but cannot be. Let's go down to the end of this chapter. What's coming? Judgment. This is Israel's immediate reality. They're facing darkness. Verse 22, they will look to the earth, and behold, distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they'll be banished into thick darkness. This is exile, judgment, destruction. Is there any hope? Yeah, next verse. I know there's a chapter break, but ignore it. But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. Out of the exile, there is a light. Verse 2, the people who walk in great darkness will see a great light.
Yeah,
those who live in the
out of the exile, because these people get exiled. So that's not Christianity. That's not the birth of this Messiah. That's just a historical event that is taken as a time of judgment by God of Yahweh because of disobedience. It's pretty clear. And with regards to the remnant, that you have to kind of read the entire book of Isaiah and find out like what could he possibly be meaning that about this remnant. And it's a remnant. It's really what it is essentially is the survivors of the exile that do come back, that preserve the worship of Yahweh. Who are these people exactly? We don't know. But in a way, Isaiah, all he's trying to do with that is simply saying that, of all these people that were taken captive, and in spite of all the atrocities and all the very bad things that the Assyrians did to us and whatnot, Yahweh was still hopeful, and he is still loving to allow some, and maybe that's sort of like miraculous in itself. that in spite of all the killing, if you will, which I don't think really happened. I think mostly what happened in these exiles is that the rich people in the aristocracy were taken captive to sort of like prevent nations from rebelling against conquering empires and sort of like disarming them in a way. But they were not necessarily in the business of taking everyone like into it like captive and putting them in prison. Like that doesn't make much sense. That's not generally what went on.
The land of the shadow of death, a light will shine on them. What is this light? Verse 6. And there's lots of verses I'm skipping over. They all fit. Okay, you have to kind of trust me because I only have 45 minutes. We're not, I have a semester to teach a class, but everything fits in. But just to get the big point here, who is the light? Verse 6. A child. The hope after the judgment, the light in the darkness is, for a child will be born to us. A son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness forever.
See, that's that kind of verse that he just gets right into naming these different titles because are part of like these names that are part of the tradition that are just simply speaking of the conditions. And so what most academics believe concerning that second child that's part of that narrative is that this is more like Hezekiah's son. And so it's the next king over, because these events that Isaiah is describing are not things that happen in a weekend. He's relating stories and traditions that perhaps take a long span of time, like the first exile, where Assyria rips Israel. This happens in 722 BC, and then by the time Nebuchadnezzar with the Babylonians show up in the scene, that's 586 BC. So, I mean, that's like 100 and something years of conflict, of things not being resolved. And the prophet Isaiah is really just trying to do his best job at compiling that information together and giving meaning to it. He seems to kind of miss that for some reason.
Darkness is coming, but there is a light at the end of that darkness, a bright light who is a child, just like what we're going to see, exactly like what we're going to see in chapter 7. But first, chapter 10 and verse 20. Verse 20, now it will be in that day that the remnant of Israel and those of the house of Jacob who have escaped will never again rely on the one who struck them. That's what Ahaz did. He trusted on Assyria who struck him. But they're never going to do that again, but they will truly rely on Yahweh, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. I think we met this person. The hope after judgment of the remnant, they will return to the mighty God who is the Davidic king on his throne in Jerusalem on Mount Zion.
Yeah, they will return from the exile. Where do you get Christianity from that?
Your people, O Israel, may be like the sand of the sea. Only a remnant within them will return. A destructive end is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. Out of judgment, a remnant will survive and return to the mighty God. Chapter 11 is just bursting with hope. It's just full throttle. Israel's restoration out of the judgment, the forest cut down, the holy seed is the stump. It says here, then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse. And as you continue on in this chapter, it's very clear this hope centers around a person, an individual. He is a shoot. He is a branch. He comes from the stem of Jesse. He is a new David. What's his rule like? Righteous. He wears righteousness like a belt. With righteousness, he judges the poor. He transforms the earth back into Eden, verses 6, 7, 8.
By the way, like none of that happens with Christianity, Okay, well, you might consider Jesus kind of giving some speeches and sermons and judging, but that certainly is not the judgment that Isaiah has in view here. What Isaiah has in view here is more of political judgment, like, you take back the nation kind of thing. And of course, none of that happens and doesn't fit the Christian context. It's quite the opposite.
8. So let me pull this all together here. The greater context of this controversial passage, 7:14. The greater context is chapters 1 through 12, where we see a consistent portrait of Israel being hardened in her sin in order to face God's immediate judgment. All of these descriptions of God's judgment are talking about the same thing. It's all the same judgment. In a lot of descriptions, it's all the same judgment.
Guys, give me a moment. I got to take this call. I apologize. All right, here we go, folks.
The same thing with the hope. It's all the same hope. It's not multiple childs. There's one child who is born to be the king, to reign in righteousness over Israel. He is light after
Well, there
darkness.
are multiple childs. That's why you have multiple sets of names. The things that you want to insist on reading Isaiah like it's this monolith, like it's this one book that's carrying one single strand of message, but that's not really the case. You have kind of like different traditions, so different names, different characters.
Darkness. He is the owner of the land after the flooding of the invader. He is the stump that sprouts after the forest has all been chopped down. He's the branch of chapter 4, the stump of chapter 6, and the shoot of chapter 11. He's a child and a son in chapter 9. He's a new David in chapter 11. He shines in Galilee. He bears the government on his shoulders. He delights in the fear of Yahweh and wears.
By the way, all those references to the stump of Jesse and the root and all that, those are all just references to the lineage of David. Why? Because, the authors of the Hebrew Bible were certainly really interested in making sure that any and all king of Israel would be a descendant of King David. And so they are trying to preserve what's known as the patrilinear succession. So that's why everything has to do with King David. You can't have a king that's not of some descendancy of David. So
There's righteousness like a belt. He stands as a banner for.
Oh, my point in saying that is that could apply to any king in the Hebrew Bible.
The peoples, restoring the exiled remnant back to the devastated land that he owns. And all of this glory ends in chapter 12, which is a beautiful song of salvation. But look at the last line. What does it say? Celebrating God's salvation, for great in your midst is the Holy One of Israel. Great in your midst. Sounds a lot like Emmanuel, God with us. We have God with us in chapter 2.
But you can't say it sounds like, and therefore it is. No, what's really clear in Isaiah is that Yahweh is the author of salvation. And that perhaps he utilizes people to bring about signs or to, bring about certain actions or certain things. But certainly the case here that's being made by Isaiah, which fits right in with the whole criticism of the prophets against idolatry, is that if anyone is to be taking any credit for our saving, is Yahweh himself and no other. And in fact, if you give credit to someone else, you're now you're now guilty of idolatry. So it doesn't fit that way. If you think about it theologically speaking, what are they doing? They're warning people against idolatry. A Christian fulfillment of this, which completely flips the plot on its side and makes it about something else, cannot come from this.
We have God with us in chapter 4. We have God with us in chapter 10. We have God with us in chapter 12. That's Israel's hope. Israel's hope is not before the judgment, it's after the judgment. And that hope is God with us. I feel like we've got a pretty strong case, and we haven't even turned to chapter 7. I believe that chapter 7 is consistent with a message of everything else in chapters 1 through 12. If you're going to make this an 8th century child, it's going to stick out of Isaiah's message like a sore thumb. So, chapter 7. Ahaz is the king. He's being attacked by two enemies to his north, the king of Israel, or known as Ephraim, and the Arameans around Damascus. And Ahaz is terrified. And so Isaiah comes to him, verse 4, and he says, have no fear, and do not be faint-hearted because of these two stubs of smoldering firebrands. Those are his two enemies. Don't worry. They're like the last of the campfire. They're about to go out, to be extinguished. Don't worry. Don't fear. And then in verse 9, we have a warning. What does Isaiah said, Ahaz, if you do not establish your faith in Yahweh, you surely shall not be established. Isaiah is calling on Ahaz to trust. Will you trust the Lord?
Yeah.
The Lord is salvation. That's what Isaiah means, right? Yahweh is salvation. Isaiah is saying, do you believe me? Do you believe that Yahweh is salvation? Isaiah says, ask God for any sign, the greatest sign you can imagine. And Ahaz says, I will not ask. I will not test Yahweh. Why not? 2 Kings tells us. Ahaz.
It always amazes for me to see like scholars like this to clearly see that it's reading that Yahweh is the Savior and know that it's saying that, but then at the same time think that somehow all of that has to do with Jesus too.
I'm turning to 2 Kings 16. You don't have to. I'm just going to read it quickly. So Ahaz sent messengers. I'm in 2 Kings 16:7. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. I'll just stop right there. This is Israel's king saying to the pagan king of Assyria, I'm your servant and I'm your son. Do you think that Judah needs a better king who's going to serve someone else and be a son to someone else? Ahaz said, come up and say.
Yeah, that was part of the criticism. King Ahaz was not, or Ahaz was not a good king.
Save me from the hand of the king of Aram and from the hand of the king of Israel who are rising up against me. Ahaz also took the silver and gold that was found in the house of Yahweh and the treasures of the king's house and sent a gift to the king of Syria. So the king of Assyria listened to him, and the king of Assyria went up against Damascus and seized it and took the people of it away into exile to Kir and put Rezin to death. It worked. Ahaz had a choice. Who's my salvation? Is it Yahweh's salvation, or is it Assyria's my salvation? And he trusted Assyria, and he won. I mean, so it seems, right? I mean, Assyria came and defeated those enemies. Well, not quite. Ahaz thought he could save his throne by works rather than by faith. But in fact, his salvation was very short-lived indeed. Here's what the Lord said through Isaiah, verse 13, Isaiah 7:13. Right after Ahaz's response, I won't test Yahweh, right? He won't trust Yahweh is what he means. Then he said, listen now, O house of David. Is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men that you will try the patience of my God as well? It's very important. You understand that Ahaz is not going to be rewarded for his despicable lack of faith. He's effectively spitting in God's eye, saying, I don't want your salvation. I will not trust you. We know it. God does not save those who do not trust in him. So you're not expecting here some short-term hope. You're not expecting some blessing for Ahaz who has refused to trust the Lord. Verse 14. I'm going to read now. 14 through 17. It really continues through 25 and on, and I'll bring that in here where I need to a few key places. But this is the immediate context of this prophecy, of this sign. What does it mean? Why is it so controversial? Verse 14. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Immanuel. He will eat curds and honey in order that he will know to refuse evil and choose good. For before the king will know to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. Yahweh will bring on you, on your people, and on your father's house days which have never come since the day that Ephraim separated from Judah.
See, so the birth of that child and whatever sign that Isaiah has intended for that birth is directly tied to the historical context of that war that took place, the conflict that was going on during the time of Isaiah encountering King Ahaz. And he's reading it, but then now he's going to ignore it. Watch.
Judah, the king of Assyria. So what I want to do in the time we have left is I want to look at 7 crucial details that demand a future fulfillment, that preclude an immediate fulfillment, that make it impossible that there was an Immanuel born in the time of Isaiah. The first of these 7, and there's more, but I shouldn't have just 7 things to highlight, to direct your attention to. And the first one I want you to look at in verse 14 is the word you. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Now the Legacy Standard Bible is a very literal translation, but it doesn't use the fine southern word y'all here, which would make it clearer. This is you, plural. This is not a sign to you, Ahaz. Ahaz doesn't get a sign. Ahaz has forfeited by his lack of faith. Who's the sign to? You all. Who's the you all? Look at the previous verse. House of David. This is an address to the Davidic family.
Okay, so why does that preclude that it would be fulfilled within their lifetime? Like, isn't it possible that King Ahaz, who is part of the Davidic line, would have family members around him that are also part of that same family? It's like, do you not go to Buckingham Palace and expect to have the queen and her son, and that's them? Like, what are you talking about?
Ahaz has rejected God. He has no hope. But the house of David has hope, because God's made a promise in the Davidic covenant. And that hope Isaiah gives now is found in the Son. What is this hope specifically? Here's detail number 2. A virgin. The virgin will be with child and bear a son. This word virgin in the Hebrew, as you know, is alma. It is never used in the Old Testament to refer to a married woman. Never.
Okay. It is never in the Old Testament referred to a married woman. Why is that important? Like, how is that irrelevant? What you should be asking yourself is, does the Hebrew Bible ever use the word Alma to refer to just a young woman without having a sexual connotation like virginity? I would argue that is indeed the case. But why are we fixating on this aspect of it? Like, that's kind of irrelevant. Because it's no one's arguing that that word means a married person or a married young woman. The debate surrounds whether or not it should be translated virgin, because it clearly is young woman. And so why don't we just let's go to that. I I said I had some slides. So let me look it through all these here. So what are we looking at here? This is the Masoretic text, which is the standard Hebrew text that is used by most scholars who translate into modern day languages like English. We're looking at Isaiah 7:14. I've underlined the noun in question, ha'alma, which is the Hebrew for young woman. And I'm going to show you in a moment why I believe that should be always translated young woman and never translated as virgin. But that's how it looks like the Masoretic text. Now, how old is the Masoretic text? It's estimated to be about 1000 AD. So it's a little, it's not as old as we want it to be. So what do most apologists do and have been doing over the last 1800 years? And I'll tell you in a moment why that's important. We're going to look at the Greek text. Now, this is the Greek text of the LXX, the Isaiah, the Greek translation, presumably the text that would have been available to most first century Christian readers. Certainly, these so-called authors, they would have been looking at a Greek text. Why? Because we know that the Hebrew language was actually abolished, was forbidden. It became extinct by the time Jesus comes in the scene, which is kind of interesting because, the whole thing is like Yahweh inspired the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. And then by the time the New Testament comes around, Hebrew is not even a language used by most people. Perhaps maybe a scribe or two knew how to read and write. But certainly the language had changed a lot because the Assyrians forbid it. And so the Jews were forced to adopt the Aramaic alphabet and make something out of that. And so by the time Jesus is walking around, he's not really speaking Hebrew. He's speaking Aramaic. And if you were educated, which Jesus nor his disciples were, maybe you knew some Greek. But nonetheless, they have an Old Testament in Greek. So what does that say? I've underlined the word that corresponds to virgin. It's the Greek parthenos. And so we must ask ourselves, well, what does parthenos mean? Does it really mean virgin? But before we get into what that Greek word actually means, let's consider what we're trying to do here from a fundamentalist perspective. The Greek text is not an original. Well, first of all, there are no originals. All we have is like ancient manuscripts and what's written in them, but not these originals. But certainly the Greek text is not like, Isaiah didn't write in Greek. Isaiah, if he existed, he wrote in Hebrew and he wrote in Aramaic. The Greek translation takes place much later. How much later? I don't think we know. it certainly is not part of the original Septuagint translation, that, the one that's often quoted to have taken place, I think, 250 BC, because that was just limited for the first 5 books of Moses. It was not about later books. So, how old is a Greek Isaiah? It's kind of hard to tell. It's very possible that any Greek Isaiah is not older than, not older than first, second century AD or CE. Maybe a little bit older, but certainly not 800 BC. That's just like a theoretical when Isaiah would have existed. But there are no manuscripts dating to 800 BC, is what I'm saying. So how accurate is a translation to be trustworthy for drawing meaning from a text? I don't know. You should take it with a grain of salt, because you are reading a translation, and any translation is an interpretation, is not an original rendering. So take it with a grain of salt. It says Parthenos, which most will read that and be like, that means virgin. Really? I'm not so sure if it actually means virgin, for you to say, look, the Greek text says virgin, and therefore it must say virgin. I think scholars disagree. I'm showing you, this is from the Parseus project, which you can Google Parseus, where they feature the George Liddell Robert Scott Greek English lexicon. Now, this is what most would consider the, or one of the authoritative lexicons or scholarly dictionaries for the classical Greek language. Okay. So what do they say? They are giving you different renderings. Let's read them. As a primary definition for Parthenos, there's a maiden, girl. That's it. Does it speak of virginity? No. Maiden, it's a young girl. My unhappy girls, that's making a reference to a classical text. What else? It makes reference of Persephone as a young maiden. Then I see the word virgin in there in some text. But then look at number 2. Number 2, or secondary definition of that word, is of unmarried. I should say usage. So the way these lexicons work is they're going to look at how is this word used by other in other writings of the time. So you're reading like different authors here, like Homer and stuff. You've got of unmarried women who are not virgins. So did you know that there is a nuance for Parthenos making reference of unmarried women who are not virgins, which is a contradiction of the word virgin itself. So you notice how there's so much ambiguity with these words, and how much the hard work that has to go through when translating. Virgin goddess, like of Athena. Let's see what else. Number 4, the constellation Virgo. Okay. Number 5, it is used as the word pupil or student. There's another secondary meaning, an adjective of maiden, chaste. Unmarried man. And Samian earth, whatever that means. So that's within the lexicon. It's not a clear 100% Parthenos means virgin. So what do we make of that? Um, I'd say that when reading the Greek text, we should consider A, if we're going to rely on the Greek text to draw meaning about this Isaiah text, which is what Matthew is doing, first consider that the Greek Isaiah is just a translation. It's not the original composition, the original language. Number two, there's ambiguity as to how you should actually define or translate this word Parthenos. Okay? So let's think about that. What else? In the Latin, now this is looking at Jerome's Vulgate, which is a lot later rendering in the Latin language. He uses the word Virgo. What do we take from that? I don't know. I don't have a Virgo Latin lexicon, but I could only imagine that it relates to virginity. Although I don't really care much about the Latin version because that's much, much later. I'm really cared about the context of Isaiah. And so, but I think it's worth mentioning. Now, how do a modern Jewish publications translate Isaiah 7:14? They use the young woman. And you know, there are other differences between those passages too. Like if you compare Isaiah 7:14 and how it's quoted in Matthew, there are other differences, but we won't get it into those today. Now, last thing I want to show you before I move on to the video is this. This is an image from the Isaiah found in cave number 1 in Qumran of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, which I think this manuscript puts the nail in the coffin of this whole virgin misinterpretation. Because if there is something that I think could provide much stronger support towards whether or not it's Alma or something else. Oh, by the way, I need to talk to you about what Alma means, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, you would think that by the 2nd century BC or 1st century BC, from where this comes from, that if the actual rendering for that is something related to a virgin of some sort, that it would show up in here. Like I'd expect that many apologists, when hearing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, they were probably salivating at the possibility that the Isaiah in Qumran would utilize the word Batula, which is the actual word for virgin in Hebrew, instead of Alma, which is just young woman. But indeed, the Dead Sea Scroll text that as preserved actually says Ha-Alma. And I've underlined the Hebrew itself. It's the very last word on the right. It's on the 3rd line from the top. And that right there says Ha-Alma. And so now what does Alma mean in the Hebrew? Well, for that, I turn to the, this is the Halot, or the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, which when I was in seminary, that was considered the authoritative lexicon for Hebrew and, in this case, also Aramaic for Isaiah, although we're talking about Hebrew here. There is another section in Isaiah that is in Aramaic, but it's not this one. Ha-Alma is defined different ways, of course, but is nonetheless identified by the editors of the lexicon under the subheading C, a young woman, which is in the bold letters. And you can see in the red letters Isaiah 7:14, The fact that Isaiah 7:14 is there tells me that the editors have classified specifically for you and I that the word ha'alma in the Hebrew in Isaiah 7:14 is used as a young woman. So what do we make of this, folks? In the Hebrew, it says young woman. It doesn't say virgin. And even in the Greek text, you could make a case that it does not say virgin either. It could also be a word that at the time of the translation of Isaiah, it was a good candidate for young woman. And so therefore, shouldn't we interpret it as such?
Claim that this word can refer to any young woman without regard to her sexual status. That's false. That's not true. It is never used to refer to a married woman. So you say, well, okay, but it's an unmarried woman. Well, what do you call an unmarried woman who is not chaste, who's not sexually pure, and she's guilty of immorality? And there's commands in the law about what should happen. This woman here, this Alma, is not a sexually immoral woman. She's not a prostitute. She gives birth to a child, and she names him God with us. This is a righteous woman. She is a virgin. Now, the reason why this debate is fast and furious, and the reason why Bible translations exist, actually, because of this word being translated, virgin or young woman, is because for this reason. If you grant that this word means virgin and virgin only, this whole debate's over. There's no more discussion. My sermon's over. Don't need to write an article. No, because nobody believes that there was a virgin who gave birth in the 8th century. So the only way to leave the door open for a immediate fulfillment in the 8th century is to insist that Alma means young woman. But it doesn't. And let me quote, this is a new book just came out in 2020. It's the whole book.
No, not really. I mean, I would even argue that even if it meant the virgin will conceive a child, my point still remains. It's not about the virgin conceiving a child that's a sign, but rather the maturity of the child. And it says it right there in 7:15. It's the maturity of the child that is what King Ahaz ought to look for as a sign. Not how the child was conceived. Because, I mean, how would that work? Because, I mean, children are conceived before they're given birth, right? So if the conception is the moment that salvation is to come, well, certainly that's not the case, because that would have meant that whatever events were to take place should be happening like immediately. But I don't think that's the case. I think that they're meant to occur in the near future, just not 700 years later.
It's about this issue. So there's a lot of articles and everything, but this is a full book-length study, very carefully done, detailed discussion. It's by Christoph Rico and Peter Gentry. The title of the book is The Mother of the Infant King. Has tons of research and data, everything. I'm going to give you the conclusion about this word Alma. From an inductive point of view, namely from the point of view of the attested evidence, the examination of all the uses, both those found in the versions and available text, leads the researcher to endorse the following conclusion. Alma designates a teenage girl who is a virgin. In the absence of any new elements, such as the necessary result, the facts point to. The Alma is a teenage girl who is a virgin. But let's just, for the sake of the argument, I still have some time, so we'll say grant the argument for the moment that, if this is a young woman or whatever, is there anything else that absolutely requires that this be something bigger? And there is. There's crucial detail number 3 is this next phrase, the virgin will be with child and bear a son. Now that phrase is also a special phrase. It's used in the Old Testament elsewhere only 2 times, both with regard to significant births. The first one, in the book of Genesis 16, the angel of the Lord speaking to Hagar says, behold, you're with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael. And in Judges 13, the angel of the Lord appears to the barren wife of Manoah, going to be the mother of Samson, and the angel says, behold, you shall be with child and give birth to a son. In both cases, the conception is announced by the Lord. To one will be born a son of Abraham, to the other, a barren woman will conceive. In other words, when you hear this phrase, will be with child and bear a son, or however you let it in Hebrew, your mind should immediately harken back to these divine announcements, which means that this virgin's child is a big deal. It's
right,
not just,
except none of those divine announcements, like I mentioned before, involve the conception of a child while the mom is a virgin. That it makes no sense.
some unknown woman who had some unknown child in the 8th century that's never again mentioned in the text. This is something much greater. Number 4. What does she name him? Emmanuel, God with us. That is not an ordinary child's name. It's not the name of some kid born to an anonymous woman who lives and dies in the 8th century with no notice ever being given of its fulfillment. And as I've alluded to or shown you already, the greater context bears this out. In chapter 4, he's the glorious branch of Yahweh. In chapter 6, he's the holy seed. In chapter 8, Emmanuel owns the land. Chapter 9, this child is called Mighty God. In chapter 12, great is in your midst is the Holy One of Israel. This is God with us. It's a significant birth.
No, he is called God. That's actually the meaning of the name Hezekiah. So that applies to a different child, man.
He's not fulfilled.
The things that Christians want to like take all those little tidbits of, because it sounds like, wow, that sounds divine, but that has absolutely nothing to do with what the author has in mind.
Of Isaiah. Number 5, verse 15. He will eat curds and honey. What does that mean, and why is it doing here? I mean, I wish we had like a Hebrew dictionary, like we could look that up, or I wish Isaiah had like explained himself. What is curds and honey? Well, you know what? Actually, he does. Look down to verse 22, and he tells us exactly what it means. And you know, this is another one of those deal breakers. It's one of those things where if you give me this, and I don't think it's that hard, the conversation's over. This curds and honey demands that the child was born after judgment, because that's what you eat after the land has been devastated. Verse 22. Everyone that is left within the land will eat curds and honey. You know, God brought them into a good land. And you should go to that good land if you haven't already. Sign up for the seminary tour in May or next May. The good, God says, Deuteronomy 8, it's bringing them into a good land, a land with milk and honey, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil, and honey. Why are they eating curds and honey? It's because the cultivated land has been destroyed. Why? Because the Assyrians have come. Why? Because Ahaz said, save me, Assyria. So Assyria came, the river overflowed its banks, and destroyed the land. And so those who are left...
Well, I think he's way off. Honestly, like that's absolutely nothing to do with it. The reference to eating curds and honey is sort of like a poetic way for the author or the prophet in this case to say that by the time this is happening, the child, not the nation, the child will be eating curds and honey, which are products of farmed land. You know, you can't just show up somewhere and pick up curds of milk. You have to like raise the cattle and farm, you know, its milk and like process the milk and make it into actual curds. This is something that takes place. So what's significant about that is that a nation that is in the midst of war is not going to be harvesting honey and making milk curds. Okay? So that's all it is. It's just that by the time the kid can tell the difference between right and wrong, he'll be eating this. That means there will be peace at that moment. Now, does that peace last forever? It doesn't, because then other stuff happens. And then he moves on to King Hezekiah and how he deals with that.
Left, a small remnant eking out their existence. They got a few goats, and they're going scooping honey out of the hives. This is not what you would expect for someone born to the house of David. Where would you expect the prince to be born? And this prophecy is to the house of David. This is the king. He reigns on the throne of David. He's going to grow up, of course, in the palace. What do you eat in the palace? You eat palace fare. You eat lavish banquets and meat and wine and all kinds of good food. You don't eat top ramen. You don't eat rice and beans if you're in the royal family. But the reason why the virgin's child is eating curds.
I mean, if your idea of the monarchy or the time when this was happening is based on movies that basically paint King David as like a medieval king with in his court and all that lavishness, maybe is that really what was happening at the time? I don't think so.
Curds and honey.
They would have been eating just whatever the land could provide. Olives, farm animals.
Because Ahaz has invited the enemy to come and save them, but he's destroyed them. So this prophecy could not have been fulfilled because there was no child at the time of Isaiah who grew up outside the palace. No member of the royal family. Jerusalem wasn't destroyed for another 100+ years. Number 6. He will eat curds and honey in order that he will know.
No, so I think that what was going on is the superstition or the expectation at the time with regards to any and all descendants of King David is that they would be born in Bethlehem because that's the sort of like the city of David, so it was just an expectation, but it didn't necessarily have to be that he was born in Bethlehem.
Refuse evil and choose good. Now this son, this child, is clearly different than Ahab.
I mean, why do I say that? I say that because every other king was not necessarily born in Bethlehem.
Because this is exactly what Ahaz couldn't do. Ahaz couldn't refuse the evil, and he couldn't choose the good. But this child will. And he's going to learn it from growing up in a time of destruction and exile and judgment. Now you might think, well, what about Hezekiah? This is another person who's been suggested that Hezekiah is the fulfillment of this prophecy. And at first glance, Hezekiah looks like a really good candidate. Because when, it's very interesting, in Isaiah 36 and 37, you have like deja vu, where the same thing seemed to happen with the son Hezekiah that it happened with Ahaz. So Isaiah showed up to Ahaz and says, don't fear, trust the Lord. And Ahaz says, no, thank you, I will trust Assyria. And what does Hezekiah do? I will trust the Lord. And what does he get? Right? He's saved. He's saved from the Assyrian invasion. The angel Lord goes out in the middle of the night, and the Assyrian soldiers are dead. And you're like, yes, I mean, this is the one who trusts Isaiah, who trusts Yahweh's salvation. And then you turn the page, and who is Hezekiah trusting? When Babylon shows up, and Isaiah says, you trust Babylon, Babylon will be your savior. No. The child who eats curds and honey to know to refuse the evil and choose the good is not Ahaz, and it is not Hezekiah. But actually fits very well with the child described in chapter 11. What does it say about the shoot from the stump of Jesse? It says that he has the spirit of Yahweh upon him. It says that he delights in the fear of Yahweh. It says that he does not judge by what his eyes see, but with righteousness he judges the poor. And that righteousness is a belt around his waist. Does that sound awfully similar here? The one who knows how to choose the good is the one who is dressed in righteousness.
The thing is, you can't paste that onto Jesus, because Jesus never really exercised role as a king. So that's not really fair. These guys were put to the test. You become the king of a nation. You're now in power. You have all these responsibilities. Acting righteously, I can't imagine it would have been an easy thing for anyone, even someone that was considered to be anointed by Yahweh, as was the case for every other king. So to say that this is applicable to Jesus, I strongly disagree, because he never actually served as king. Oh, now, but wait a minute, Mr. Atheist. That's the second coming. Well, that's bullshit.
Child. The child who knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good is the future son of David who succeeds, where all previous kings, including Hezekiah and Josiah, fell short. In number 7. The seventh thing I want you to see in this passage is the question of the timing. Verse 16. This is where they say, oh, no, it has to be. I want you to look at it. I want you to see if it has to be. I don't think so. I think everything else is we have a pretty strong cumulative case that there's no immediate hope for the nation, that hope is on the other side of exile. Does this contradict that? What does it say? For before the boy will know to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose 2 kings you dread will be forsaken. So does this mean that the child has to be born then? It doesn't.
No, what it says is that by the time the kid will know the difference between right and wrong. So whatever the time you'd say that the kid would come of age, that's the time that the prophet Isaiah, based on the sign that he's talking about, the two offending, those two nations that are like trying to attack you, your enemies, your arch enemies, will have been taken care of. That's it. I mean, and that's actually the case, by the way, because it was not until the Babylonians arrived that took captive Jerusalem. The Assyrians never took Jerusalem.
The reason I say that is because they bring in from outside the text a faulty assumption. And the assumption is this, that the child must be born before the Assyrian invasion. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that the child is born before the Assyrian invasion. Verse 17, Yahweh's going to bring on you and on your people the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria is going to destroy the land of the king. So here's the sequence, really simple. First, Assyria destroys the land of the enemies, Aram in Israel. And then Assyria destroys the land of Judah. And then the child eats curds and honey. Does not say the child was born already. Child be born. Doesn't say when the child is born. It says that he.
So how could the child eat the curds and the honey without being born?
He eats curds and honey because the land has been destroyed by the invaders. So in other words, the land is destroyed before the virgin conceives.
No, it's because that by the time that he's able to do this, there will be a time of peace when people could actually farm. Like, what do you think kids ate? Like, they think people just went to Walmart and, they bought like baby food. They probably ate honey and curds. Like, that's what you feed kids.
The child who eats curds and honey knows to refuse evil and choose good. And this doesn't occur until 586 and beyond, when the Babylonians and then the Persians and then the Greeks and the Romans. There's my conclusion. What is Isaiah's message? What is the uniform?
No, it's just that, the history moves on. If Isaiah existed when we think he existed in the 8th century BC, he wouldn't have been alive in 586 BC when the Babylonians take Jerusalem captive and destroy the temple. But there certainly would have been people living at that time that perhaps in the post-exilic period, so after they come back from captivity, when they have the freedom to things like write in expensive parchment paper, skins and stuff like that, that now they're recounting additional events that took place after the time that Isaiah technically lived. So that's part of the argument why Isaiah is not considered to be like this monolithic book given or provided, information provided by one single author, but rather various traditions that then got amalgamated and put together. So that's why you see those abrupt changes in the text. So my point with that is that by the time the next event happens, the prophet's sort of like still relating the same issue within the same thread, but all of it is happening within a certain time frame that, again, I stress strongly, it has nothing to do with the context of Jesus. It's so far depart from it that it doesn't fit at all.
Prophecy that he's giving through these chapters and on. I mean, the book doesn't end in chapter 12. Right? There's some glory, astonishing glory beyond, of course. Isaiah's message is that there's no short-term hope for a wicked nation. Judgment is coming. Israel is a sinful nation, a people loaded with guilt. Isaiah's commissioned to preach so their eyes are completely blind and their ears are completely deaf and their hearts are totally hardened. They're like Sodom in their sin, and they're going to be like Sodom in their judgment, except that the Lord will preserve a remnant. And in that remnant is their hope. There's a single hope for the nation, not multiple hopes. There are not multiple children born in different centuries who signify multiple hopes. There is no short-term hope. There is a long-term promise. There is a light on the far side of the darkness. There is a lone stump on the far side of judgment. There is one child born during exile, raised as a prince outside the palace, growing up in Galilee, not in Jerusalem, eating curds and honey instead of dining at royal banquets. He is the branch, the stump, and the shoot. He is the holy seed, the virgin-born child, the child born unto us, upon whose shoulders the government will rest, so that he reigns on David's throne without end, establishing justice and righteousness. He is Emmanuel, mighty God. He's the Holy One of Israel, who is great in Israel's midst. And under his rule, the earth will be flooded, not with the Assyrian river. The earth will be flooded with the knowledge of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. He's Israel's hope, and he's our hope. Let's pray. Father, we love.
So that's it. So he just ended it, folks. I'm honestly very disappointed because, this is Todd Bolen. He's a top-notch scholar over at the Master Seminary, and I still remain unconvinced, folks. And to me, it just makes much more sense when you read it from like the perspective of the actual Hebrew Bible itself, considering the tradition, considering what the actual lexicons have to say, the scholarly dictionaries that inform translators on what to actually do when it comes to reading a text that's in a foreign language, something that came from a long, long time ago. And that conclusion can only be, folks, that Isaiah 7:14 doesn't say virgin in there, and the Christian fitting or adaptation of that which only was written to serve an immediate context. It's part of a narrative that fits between right in the middle of Isaiah's ministry. It doesn't fit a Christian model. It has to be forced. The only way that it can be forced is by doing two things: mistranslating a word and fitting a completely new and different context to it. Namely, making it about virginity, which was not a thing of the Jews. This is more of a Greco-Roman thing. And making it about the conception of not just any child, but the conception of a child between a God and a human being, which, by the way, is 100% missing from the context of Isaiah as well. In the context of Isaiah, those children that are given birth through those narratives, like the Immanuel, are not made reference to. Like, this has nothing to do with Yahweh conceiving, human females. So maybe if it did, I could agree with the Christian interpretation. But since the context is so different, I just have to reject it. And so with that, folks, I do want to thank you for sticking around. Those of you that have been on the video, on the live until the very end, I want to appreciate you by saying thank you. If you have not already subscribed, you're watching this in the future, please like the video. And until next time, this has been Apostate of Mind.